Welcome to the Track Your Life podcast. My name is Boyd Varty. I think of myself as an artist of experience. My passion is to create transformational experiences for myself and others as a way to explore what it means to truly live. My center of exploration is to live on what I would call the track of your life. To me, this is to live courageously towards the discovery of what you are called to and to what life asks of you. So much of how I live has been informed by my experience as an animal tracker. I'm following the trail of my own life and reporting back. We are going story hunting. This show is an exploration of the art form and the magic of storytelling as a way to structure awareness and make meaning of the world. We will chase stories to remote places, seek out unique characters, and break down the archetypal characteristics of stories that transcend time and space. We will learn to live as story hunters, and it is my hope that by sharing in my stories, you will become the architect of your own. Story Hunter Introduction. How it all started. This podcast is a series about storytelling. Storytelling is an ancient shamanic art, and a person who can tell a story is gifted with the ability to help people understand and feel. From the time I was young, around campfires, I watched the magic of the oral tradition in action, and storytelling has always been a fascination. A story told around a fire is an act of beauty to me. It's vibratory resonance. It's telepathy. A truly brilliant storyteller is conveying audio wavelengths of feelings. He's structuring awareness. This is why storytelling is magic. It falls to me uniquely like tracking, chemistry, singing and dancing into the quiver of the shaman. And I'm always interested in that. In these next episodes, I'm hoping that we can explore the art form together. Story Hunter is stories about stories. It's thoughts on what brings a story to life. And it's also an attempt and a desire to at times capture stories. Story Hunter is something I need to do. I need to write. I need to hunt stories. It's how I make sense of the world, especially when I'm changing, like I'm changing now. In a few months, I'm going to turn 40. I don't know how that happened. I'm standing at some threshold. I can't see it, but I can sense I'm in that change of life. So much of how I have been living suddenly seems to have stopped working. Have you ever had that moment? Something needs to be shed so a new way can come to me. And I will tell you that it's unsettling and exciting. I like being a season. I like sensing when it's time to change. But there's a grieving to it, to let go of a way of life that I've spent so much time building and sit in something unknown so a new way can come. It makes me think of something my teacher Martha Beck once said to me. And it's funny how a single sentence can stick in you. This was one of those. I remember the exact moment when Martha said it. We were driving through the streets of Phoenix, Arizona, in her white Mercedes. At that time in my life, I was so burnt out and fried that at age 25, I felt like I was 70. Creative people bounce, she said. Creative people bounce. My God, when I heard that, a glimmer of hope. Creative people bounce. There's a resiliency to someone who has art, songs, oils, strings, or ink, but it doesn't even need to be art school art. No, really anything that would put you into the spirit of a presence or to presence itself. An awareness that something other can come through. Something that is both entirely you and not you at all is art. Your co-creation with the universe. If you can find a way to express yourself, you have catharsis. If you have catharsis, you have emptiness. If you have emptiness, you have a vacuum. And if you have a vacuum, life force, nature will naturally fill it. If you can learn to be leveled intentionally, there is always a chance for resurrection. Creative people bounce. And this is me bouncing. This is me coming back to life, to a new life. This is how I shed a skin. And this is how the Story Hunter was born. After 3 years of almost endless travel, I felt a deep desire to ground myself back into wild places. I wanted to disappear for a while. I wanted to be off the radar and off my phone and vacant from email. I like the idea of artists disappearing periodically. In fact, I've come to think of anonymity as one of life's deepest gifts. There is a purity to art forms that occur in unseen places nowadays. And so I went back to Africa to disappear for a while into the wild. And then, almost instinctively, after a period of time, I found myself chasing and attuning to stories again. And this is the series that emerged out of that time, because I must put my spirit somewhere, I must put my life somewhere, I must put my art somewhere, and this is how I make meaning. But it's more than that too. I've come to think that the world needs oral storytellers, oral traditions. I feel I'm keeping some old way alive. And not that anyone has asked me to, it's a very personal compulsion. But storytellers have always been the meaning makers of the time they were in. And we need meaning makers in this time. We need meaning like we need air. We need context and a narrative. I say we, but maybe it's just I. It just makes it more meaningful when the quest is bigger than me. See how each word matters. And so I find myself going back to the wild with journalistic intent and a propensity for creative license. I travel to campfires everywhere to meet those who have lived close to the wild, particularly the First Nation people, the Bushmen. I found myself on pioneer towns and driving along rutted roads. My journey specifically took me to the wild places of Botswana and always the bushveld of eastern South Africa. I like being around those who speak the language of the wild, those who embody a different level of understanding of what it means to be wild. I was particular about who I sought out. I've never really been interested in the science of the natural world. Rather, I'm always looking for something deeper and more intuitive. I want to talk to those who can help me deepen my understanding of how wilderness is a doorway to soul. Humans are narrative creatures, and in each story, I began to find answers. In the end, each story was a thread of medicine in my own journey and in the web of my own life. I suggest that this podcast should be listened to like an album. It's a journey of both live stories and breakdowns on the archetypal characteristics of storytelling. It's stories and thoughts about those stories. And I hope that listening to this will help you become a better storyteller. I'm looking for the old ways, old stories, campfire cool. And in some ways, this is where a part of my broken heart goes. This is where my fascination with living goes. This is my gratitude to live. I turn back to my art and the art of storytelling to help me write a new story for a new iteration of my life. This is how I became the story hunter. Story Hunter Episode 1. Be someone stories happen around. I'll tell you, there is no easy way to buy a motorbike in Kampala. I once drove a 150cc Boxer Bajaj motorbike down the Rift Valley from Kampala to Lilongwe. In my early 20s, I was drawn to adventures, in the way that many young men are by a combination of naivety and the unconscious longing for danger. A young man and a young woman must learn if they are strong. My friend Andrew had conceived of the idea a few months before in a cafe in Cape Town. I remember the clouds were curling off the top of Table Mountain when he burst into the cafe carrying a map of Africa folded 50 times and a pack of Marlboro Reds. Andrew was a mountain of a man, well over 6'5", and he had the confidence that only comes from being consistently bigger than other people. Andrew's lead strategy for solving problems in life was saying, "We'll be fine." He unfolded the map, and I remember him sticking a thick finger onto the Rift Valley. He started pointing out the route. We would run from Kampala to Bwindi Impenetrable Forest, then on to Rwanda, then into the Burundi, names of places that I had only heard associated with genocide. We would run a gauntlet through the eastern Congo, if they let us in. And then the idea was to catch an old German ferry down Lake Tanganyika into Tanzania, eventually crossing into Malawi at the outpost of Mbeya. "This road is fucked," he said. "This area has a militia and a few warlords, but we'll be fine." Africa's Rift Valley is beautiful. It runs like a scar down the face of Africa, from Syria to Maputoland in South Africa. And there is a myth in Africa that the Great Rift was caused when the Milky Way was pulled out of the continent. It's volcanic, it's tropical, it's unstable, both in topography and politics. The risks of simply being on a motorbike in these type of roads is immense. The roads are a maze of goats, trucks, mud, and potholes. If we should have an accident out there, there would be no medical assistance. And it's true that as I've gotten older, I've become more risk averse. And yet there is a constant tension. There is a grave danger to a life with no danger. To stay solely within the confines of what is known, on some level, is to court death. Certainly the death of life force, the death of spirit. "Can we buy bikes in Kampala?" I remember asking. "Easy," said Andrew. "We'll be fine." The trouble began when, upon touching down in Kampala, we caught a taxi to a backpacker's. I'd already lost Andrew for a while in the airport, as he had been detained on account of not having a visa. He had managed to wiggle his way out of that bureaucratic issue with the cunning use of a put-on Irish accent and a second passport. Driving out of the airport into the smoky evening light of Kampala was like landing in another world. And I remember the first thing I saw was a Land Cruiser with a motorbike sticking out of the bonnet. "Shit, dude, that Land Cruiser ate that motorbike," I said to Andrew. "We'll be fine," he said quietly. The next morning we woke in our sleeping bags to the sound of village roosters. It was time to go bike shopping. Now this was in the years just after university and before I had any real financial resources. We had budgeted $2,000 for our bikes, $1,000 each, which we intended to buy in Kampala and then sell at the end of the trip. The bikes were the major expense and the center of our shoestring budgeting process. In the bustling streets of Kampala, we ran into our first Africa-specific issue. The bikes needed to be bought with cash. In this case, Ugandan shillings, issue number 1. Issue number 2, you can't get more than $200 cash from the banks a day in Uganda. We needed $2,000, then converted into shillings. For hours we tried all sorts of things. We tried banks, Western Unions. We were trying to work out if we could get the wire money transferred. Everything was impossible. And I remember eventually asking a bank manager, "How do people buy larger items in Kampala?" "Oh," he said, "you must draw the money over a few weeks. Then you can buy." We didn't have a few weeks. The whole trip was only 2 weeks. The entire trip was in jeopardy now. We needed to be on the road by tomorrow to make it to Lilongwe in order for us to be able to show up for our post-college jobs. We trekked around in the heat and traffic, getting more despondent by the moment. Eventually, like one does in their 20s, we found a bar that looked out over Kampala. We ordered a few beers and lit a couple of sportsman cigarettes. At that time, I was experimenting with smoking as an identity. Out over the red roofs of Kampala, in the distance, I saw a sign. "Simba Casino," it read. I looked at Andrew and said as a joke, "Maybe we just gamble for the money." The minute I said it, I realized my mistake. Andrew's eyes lit up. "Brilliant," he said. "Now you can't get $2,000 in cash, but you can get it in Simba Casino chips." "Fuck, Andrew," I said, "we can't gamble with the bike money. That's all we've got." "Don't worry, I can count cards," was his response. "We'll be fine." Around Andrew, I found myself often along for the ride. His appetite for risk and his faith that things were going to work out always produced an adventure. and although it scared me, I also loved it. On hikes with Andrew, we almost always left the trail to make our own path. "Let's go this way, it'll be more interesting," he would say. At the Simba Casino, the woman behind the cage made a call upstairs. "I can give you $200 in chips, but you must play for an hour." A menacing-looking bouncer in the corner cracked his knuckles and glared at us. And so it came to be that I found myself sitting at a blackjack table in a Kampala casino, drinking, while Andrew played cards with the entire budget of our motorbike trip. For about 30 minutes, Andrew just lost money, and I drank beers more heavily. And then what followed was an incredible hot streak, as if the gods were with us. Eventually, we went up $2,050. We even rolled the last 50 on the roulette table on black. We cashed in our chips into a duffel bag full of Ugandan shillings and strode out of the casino. "Told you," said Andrew. "No problems. We'll be fine." By sunset, we were the owners of 2 bikes, and by dawn the next day, we were on the road. And as we rode out of Kampala, I had the feeling that Africa was swallowing us. So much had to go right for us to make it unscathed to the end of the trip, but I had a little more confidence now. We were riding very close to the edge, and there was an incredible aliveness there. If you are to become like me, a story hunter, you must live a life of stories. You cannot become a storyteller without living stories and seeing how lived experience makes narrative, which makes meaning. You have to find a way to say yes to life beyond the known. And this doesn't mean you have to go on grand adventures. I can guarantee you there is a story across town if you can learn to say yes to life. The American entrepreneur Jesse Eisler has this idea that time is undefeated, meaning that until you go for an experience, adventure, new opportunity, they live only as potential that time owns. And time is undefeated. The minute you take action towards it, do it, time can't take it from you. Time wins until you take action. Then it's yours forever. So what that means is to be a story hunter, you have to plan. You have to put it on the calendar now. You have to look for mountains. You have to look for long trips by foot or by car. You have to make friends with as many Andrews as you can. Someone who pulls your life into stories. Say yes to something you normally wouldn't. Follow your own interest. Curiosity will pull you into unknown circles. You have to be someone who pulls other lives into stories. You have to be someone stories happen around. Try not to plan where you will sleep on these adventures. Book air tickets. Be impulsive. Put things you talk about on the calendar today. Right now, go and book that time. If you like walking, go walk. If you like flowers, follow blooms around the world. There's a way to find your way into adventures. In fact, I heard there's a bloom in Death Valley right now. If you like food, be in kitchens. Seek out people and places that resonate with things that you're naturally curious about and commit to being in those spaces. If you can be in the space, adventures will emerge out of it. A story hunter is a meaning maker. In order to take up that role, you must live in wild stories so that people can feel the authenticity on you when you talk. This is a strange and critical job for this time. Your first assignment is to make a friend who loves adventures. Cross off the dates on your calendar. Book flights. Drive across town. Make a friend at the local bird-watching society. Seek out subcultures. Be someone stories happens around. Time is undefeated. You are the story hunter. Let the stories hunt you. Story Hunter Episode 2. How it looked to Amber. Stories are attention. Moods are for the benefit of others. Anger, frustrated, sulking, skulking, bulking. All moody moods for the benefit of others. A mood is nonverbal communication. Moods are imposing your energy on a space while acting like you're not. And I guarantee you, your moods are for others. And you know how I know this? In 2020, I lived alone in a tree for 40 days and 40 nights. totally alone in the African wilderness. Some of you will remember this. And one thing you notice, living in that kind of solitude, no moods. There's no one around to enjoy them / impose them on, so they just don't show up. Sometimes you'll have a little outburst, stub your toe, burst of rage, but then it's gone. Moods just do not hang around in solitude. When I went to the tree, people were really worried about me living in the wild alone. What about lions, snakes, scorpions? Anything could happen out there. You know, I wanted that. I wanted something to happen. It's a very masculine sort of thing, right? There is a part of us that wants to test ourselves in nature. We want to find out what we're made of. Now, Barry was an old buffalo bull that lived in the reeds below the treehouse. He had blunt horns and he was blind in the right eye. He was grumpy, and you had to be very wary walking around the camp at night. A black buffalo on a black night is a good way to become a kebab, a kaboid kebab. On my third day in the tree, I decided to do some naked sunbathing, commune with nature. No mood, just naked and rude. Stretch out in the sun, silent sounds of the birds. And I will tell you, as I lay there in total solitude, naked in the African wild, I was about as happy as I had ever been. I remember somewhere nearby a fish eagle called. "Ah, ah, ah." Anything could happen out there. I heard the voices of all those alarmists. Anything could happen out there. Didn't they know I was a wild man, perfectly in tune with nature? I'm as at home out there as a leopard, I thought, as I slid my underpants back on, failing to notice a hairy caterpillar that had made its home in this particular banana hammock. The onset of the pain was sudden, a mixture of itching, burning, singeing. I knew I was in serious trouble, and I knew I must not scratch. But the itch was too much. Huge red welts, blistering red welts start to appear all over me. And I break. I start scratching. Now, moods might be for others, but the sound I was making at that moment was just for me. I called it panic drone. Ah! I'm on fire. Now I ran to my supply kit, rummaging for antihistamine. Fuck! No antihistamine! Ah! Cut to annoying people in my mind. Anything could happen out there. Cut to an image of me punching that person in my mind's eye. Cut back to reality. Panic drone. Ah! No cream except sun cream. Fuck! Start ripping clothes off. Run to the river. From the treehouse in underpants. Looked like a pork sausage dipped in hair of a freshly shorn wolf and then singed on an open fire. Not attractive. As I run to the water, rip underpants off and throw them into the reed. Ah! Leap into the water. Surprising blind Barry the buffalo. He charges at me, probably just afraid. Run from the buffalo, naked and wet. Buff breaks into the reeds, picks up underpants on one of his horns, run back to first aid kit, decide I need cream, sun cream, whipped cream, any bloody cream, spray myself with sun cream and lather it over my naked body till I look like a cream scone made love to a ghost and had me. Right then, a supply Land Rover arrives into the camp to find me naked and covered in an inch of sun cream from head to foot. This was close to the end of my trip. The driver drove up and just looked at me for a long moment. "Are you okay?" he said. And I remember looking at him, covered in cream. "Yeah, I'm totally fine." You seem a little weird," he said. "Nah, I'm fine. Just a bit sunburned." Just then, to add weirdness to the moment, a blind buff walked slowly, but like painfully slowly into the scene, with underpants on his horn. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Yeah, man. All good here," I say. Moods are for others, but shame can last a lifetime. This is a classic storytelling bit. The gimmick is there are unrelated chords that start to come together. The characters are me, the buffalo, the skeptical voices of others. The story has threads. These threads can stand alone, but ultimately will need to intersect. Each thread creates a context, but you must also trust an audience to catch up and co-create with you. If you had been there that day, it might not have looked exactly like this. I relate to this not as a series of events, but rather as the colliding of elements, hence situational comedy. Yet, this is the way the situation lands on my eyes. I need to pay attention to find the comedy. My friend Amber used to laugh when she would hear me tell stories about a dinner we had both been at together. "Wow, Bess," she would say, "you got all of that from dinner? Were we even at the same dinner?" Now, everything I said was true and happened. If the story is a lie, it won't feel authentic. The art of storytelling is to have an attention that sees these details and threads. It's all there if you can look deep enough. If the truth is stranger than fiction, then the art of storytelling is not to make something up, but rather to really see what is there. Reality, if you look close enough, is almost always hilarious. That is why, in some fundamental way, stories are not narrative, but attention and self-awareness. You are the seer, the translator, the narrator. If you are a story hunter, you are an instrument for meaning, a way to make the village understand. Storytellers are context creators. More on context. As a boy, I grew up in the safari business. My father and mother were the proprietors of our camp in the wild, and my father was in fact the lead guide and the lead entrepreneur. He had started the business and had worked tirelessly to get it going. Guests would come from Johannesburg down on a Friday afternoon, and by Saturday morning they would find themselves on foot tracking lions. One of the guests by the name of Jerry Brown had an old Nikon camera. When they eventually found the lions, all hell broke loose, and a big male charged at the group. What followed was 30 seconds of terror, and my father screamed at everyone to stand still as the lion charged. The lion was growling. He came right at them before turning and running back into the thicket. The guests were somewhere between terrified survivors and exhilarated safari goers. That night around the fire, my father would tell the story as is traditional in the safari world. I remember snippets from that, him lit by the firelight. "It was incredible," he said, leaping out of his chair. "The tracks were so fresh, beautiful pug marks in powdery sand." His eyes would be alight with excitement. Then, there in the grass ahead, this lion rises out, tawny and beautiful. He comes straight at us, and I knew he was just warning us to move back. My father, so excited now, has recast the event as he retells the story. "So few people have ever seen a lion like that," he says. "And all of you stood your ground. Amazing." No longer are the guests scared urban dwellers, but instead they are part of a wild adventure. Jerry Brown leaps to his feet and tells the crowd, "I pulled my wife behind me as she snapped a shot." My father, as the storyteller, is helping the group understand how they should feel about what happened. He is contexting and meaning maker. If you are a guide, a CEO, a father, a mother, a leader, most of your job is to pay enough attention that you can see what's really going on. Storytelling is a discipline of attention to help people understand why something happened and how to feel about it. If you can help people understand how to feel about anything, you become a guide. Those guests would go back to the city and retell the story at every social event they went to. And as a result, new guests poured into the doors of our safari camp. People seeking adventures like they had heard about. I understood then that so much of life is how we cast ourselves into the story. Storytelling is seeing. Storytelling is context. Storytelling is leading. Storytelling is life. And that is why you must become a story hunter. Story Hunter, Episode 3. Nothing bad ever happened to a story hunter. The trouble in this case had begun the night before. when Renius got a bad case of gout. His toe had swelled up like an aubergine, and he couldn't walk. Which was bad, because he was the head tracker. One of the great advantages of being with Renius in the bush was that it was like being with a human GPS. He never got lost. He was like a sea turtle with some internal navigation system that could always guide him home. After hours of walking, head down, staring at faint animal tracks in thick bush, he would walk a beeline through the terrain back to where he had left the Land Rover. His gout meant it would be Alex and I to guide the group. Every year through the winter months in the African bush, I run a retreat series called Track Your Life. The idea is a deep immersion into the wild, tracking animals and using the principles and psychology of tracking to discuss how we live and discover our mission and purpose. We're all looking for something. We're all tracking something. And the mentality and the approach of the tracker can help us so much with thinking about this quest and endeavor. The participants had come hoping to find a new way. But now, Alex and I were totally lost. It happened slowly and then fast. We cut the tracks of a pride of lions coming into our property. Excitement rippled through the group. This is what we'd been hoping for. We readied ourselves, grabbing rifles. We did a safety briefing, and then we started tracking. The tracks ran almost immediately into thick Terminalia bushveld. Alex and I were tracking and teaching at the same time. We were concentrating hard so as not to lose the lion tracks. Our heads were down. But then we did lose the tracks. And I remember when I lifted my head, there was identical looking brush in every direction. And that cold chilled anyone who has been lost in the wild, blew like a glacial draft through my confidence. Alex ahead of me still had his head down. Mfo, I said in Shangaan. Ufamikwi. I was speaking in Shangaan so the guests wouldn't hear me, basically saying, where are we going? We were now lost in thick bush with a pride of lions, somewhere close by. Just stand by here, guys, I said to the group, who immediately sensed something was up. I tried to backtrack, but because of the hard ground and grass, I got into that situation where you lose the track and have to backtrack and then find your own track that you've just made backtracking, and soon you confuse yourself even more. My mind flashed to a poem by David Wagner. It's advice from a native elder to a boy who is lost in the woods, and I really like it. The poem goes like this. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. To me, this is Wagner, via a native elder, helping us understand to become present when we are uncertain where we are. That wasn't what was happening to me now. You see, the truth is that I was embarrassed. My role as intrepid leader was crumbling into the truth that I was lost. And more than that, I had gotten the participants lost in lion country. The situation was wobbling, and with it, my role and persona was taking a wobble too. Now we started walking aimlessly under pressure. Alex and I argued tensely in Shangaan. The guests trudged behind us suspiciously. At one point, we silenced the group and asked a nearby safari guide via two-way radio to rev his Land Rover as loud as he could so we could get a bearing on where the road might be. Quiet, quiet, we said to the guests. Listen for an engine revving. The bush was thick in our face. Far off we heard the revving. Every guest pointed in a different direction. The sound was bouncing through the thicket. It only added to the confusion. A herd of elephants moving our way compounded the issue. We had to navigate away from them, further confusing our situation. And here's the thing. Objectively, being lost was not a crisis. We would eventually find a road and reorientate ourselves. My story about what being lost meant was causing me more stress. An inner voice had started to whisper, "You're not very competent, are you? You've been foolish. You will never get out." My mind likes to go global in future. Everyone thinks you don't know what you're doing. There are sub-stories that build in the meta when you are lost. You see, a story is a layer cake of meaning. Meaning is almost always a constellation of thoughts and beliefs that weave into a story. I was overlaying the situation with an internal narrative. Often what is objectively happening and what we make it mean are not the same. It's an awakened discipline to even be aware of this. The situation in that moment was actually okay. We were uncertain, but nothing terrible was happening. But I was overlaying a whole layer onto it. One must learn to choose one story. I'm not talking about denial or refusing responsibility. I'm talking about choosing a story, rather, that is generative. A story that sheds the internal critical and gives you space to discover and learn. In this case, in order to change the experience, I had to change the meaning structure of the story internally. The remedy to the embarrassment in this instance and the shame was open authenticity, both as part of my internal story and the story I was telling. I remember turning to the group. "Guys, we're a little lost. It sometimes happens in thick bush when your head is down." And I remember as I said it, it was like someone deflated a balloon in my chest. Suddenly the pressure started to relieve. "We're going to walk for 15 minutes in that direction towards high ground and try and hit a road," said Alex. This step away from my internal story into open authenticity seemed to change the whole energy and the momentum of the group. The energy swung back towards us. And now, with that energy swing, a strange thing happened. Because we had been moving intuitively as a result of being lost, we had naturally taken the easiest route through the bush, which is the same route the lions had intuitively walked. And suddenly we were back on the tracks. Then we burst out onto a road, suddenly orientating ourselves, and at the same time getting an incredible sighting of the lions that were lying 50 meters up the road. "You see," said a guest from Switzerland, "sometimes it's good to get lost." Later that day, as we drove back to camp, I heard every person on the back of the safari truck making meaning of the morning in their own way. I was struck by the fact that each person was now story hunting. I realized something. "You shouldn't go out without your best tracker," said one of the clients. "Just mess around until something happens. Being lost is a part of being found." Small lessons were emerging out of the confusion of the morning. This is something I've seen endlessly in retreats and ceremony work. People learn the basic universal lesson that there is always something unfolding as it should. The suffering is always your adversity to that unfolding. Telling the internal story, something else should be happening. Something happened to the participants on the retreat, and they went quickly into the metaphorical, which is one of the profoundly powerful byproducts that occurs in nature. We are pulled into an unfolding co-creative story by just being in nature. We are catapulted into meaning making. If your life has lost meaning, go and spend time in nature. Things will start to happen that will add layers and threads of meaning back in. I learned a lot during those few hours of being lost. I learned about my own personas and roles and how they hold me hostage, and I learned how authenticity is freedom. I learned my internal story is like a pair of glasses I look through into my world, and so I must choose my internal story wisely. But most importantly, and I've come a very long way around to make the point, I learned that nothing bad ever happened to a story hunter. Once you have cast yourself as the protagonist and become aware of your story, you have begun to wake up. You can choose supportive meaning making. Learn to choose your internal story. And choice here is an important word. When you take on the role of story hunter, you choose curiosity over control. You choose surrender to what is. Where does the story go? How might I tell this story for humor or drama? In doing this, you actively foist yourself from the controlling left brain into the creative right hemisphere. It's very hard to be in your creative right hemisphere and be anxious. When you become the story hunter with creative intention, you choose a creative, anxiety-free right brain state. Literally, on a neurological level, nothing bad ever happened to storyteller, but you must cast yourself as the story hunter, the storyteller. In the safari business, we used to have an old equation. We would remind ourselves often, particularly when things were going wrong, which they often do in the safari business, suffering plus time equals humor. Things going wrong plus time equals humor. This equation can put one into a very resilient mindset. I once went for a run in the bush with a buddy, James. We set off in the late afternoon into the reserve, wearing only running shorts and shoes. It was a stinking hot bushveld day. And soon we were sweating profusely as we ran past giraffe and waterbuck and through the clearings. We crossed over the river on a narrow causeway where shallow water ran across cement. Far off on the western mountains outside of the reserve, dark clouds were building and thunder rumbled. But where we were, it was a perfectly sunny day. By the time we returned to the causeway, an hour later, the light was fading and the river had swollen. A flash flood cut us off from the camp as night was falling. By now we had run a far distance and we were tired and dehydrated. As it tends to happen in the bush, things had changed fast. James tried to wade across and was soon washed downstream, resulting in me having to fish him out with a stick. The sky darkened as night fell, and a storm from the west blew in. There was no way to get home. We were cut off. We suddenly felt very vulnerable and exposed, out in the wilderness full of lions and leopards and all manner of animals. What lay ahead was a night in the wild with no gear. Luckily, we were able to radio a Land Rover to come and get us off a handheld radio, but they soon gave up hope of being rescued as the river rose, preventing even 4x4 vehicles to cross. James and I, rather than sleep huddled in the dark against a tree fearing lions and lightning, decided to run in the last light to a cabin on our side of the river. Although the cabin was locked, we would be able to sleep on the veranda, offering us some comfort and shelter. Night was falling fast, and we covered the ground on foot, and now in the rain to the cabin. My adrenaline was spiking, running through the fading light past wild animals. I remember startling a buffalo in long grass. Yet even as the prospect of a cold night on a hard floor loomed, my inner storyteller was switching on. Suffering plus time equals humor. I knew we were making a story, even as we huddled together through the night, cold and miserable, drinking rainwater dripping off the cabin roof. Somehow knowing we were making a story made me strong. I was paying attention to every element, knowing when we eventually got back to camp, we would have so much to tell people. At dawn, the river was still flooded bank to bank, and the rain was still pouring down. We received a radio call that a small plane was leaving an airstrip 15 kilometers north of us. The plane could hop us across to our side of the river, like a small bushveld taxi. We ran through the rainy wilderness, arriving as the plane idled, ready to leave at the top of the runway. In shorts and soaking wet, we were covered in mud and grass. We boarded the plane, looking like Rambo at the end of the movie. "Wow, which safari lodge were you guys staying at?" asked an American tourist as we flopped down and the plane took off. I just smiled, because nothing bad ever happened to a story hunter. Story Hunter, Episode 4. Seek out characters to become one. Bacchus was a big man, with long, fiery red hair that matched the Damaraland desert in Namibia at sunset. I have found, as a story hunter, that remote places are often the natural habitat of wild characters, both human and animal. Bacchus had one arm after being attacked by not one, but 2 crocodiles while working as a ranger in the Kruger National Park. The first time I ever saw Bacchus, he was standing at the counter of a remote bar in the Namibian hinterland. That last wild place of desert rock and stone. Bacchus looked in his natural habitat. And he was to be our guide. When he saw us enter the bar, he picked up a pint of Namibian beer off the counter and began to down it while holding us in his gaze. As we got closer, he picked up a second pint and sank it like a homesick mole. He then turned to us with gusto and stuck out his good arm. "Hi," he said in a booming voice. "I'm Chris Bacchus." The group introduced themselves. "Hi, I'm Jim. I'm Steve. I'm David. I'm Mark. I'm Sarah. I'm Andre. I'm Tessa. Nice to meet you guys. Just let me make sure I have this right. Jim, Steve, David, Mark, Sarah, Andre, Tessa." After a quick liter of beer, Bacchus was as sharp as a whip. It was a really good trick. A one-eyed Jack Russell ran yapping up to Chris, and he scooped the dog out with his meaty arm. "This is Tier." Tier is the Afrikaans word for tiger. "This is Tier, my guard dog," said Bacchus, holding the small dog in his hand. "What happened to his eye?" someone asked. "Well," said Chris, "he bit my arm off, so I poked his eye out." Chris followed this with a booming laugh. I'll never forget that first 5 minutes with Bacchus. "He bit my arm off, so I poked his eye out." A classic line. It was gold. You could feel an adventure in the air any time you were near Bacchus. He was definitely someone stories happen around. Everything about him felt earned. The wild had left storied scars on him. The desert seemed to have etched itself into his skin. I wanted to sit by a fire with him and hear all the stories. Finding characters in life is becoming harder as life becomes more homogenized, more captured by social media. Characters almost always have found their own uniqueness and a path to express it. They seem to fit what they're doing. They know what lights them up. They know what they have to offer, and almost always they know how to live in a way that is unique to them. Our narratives feel so mundane nowadays. Even our breakout stories are shared on social media until they become templates of van life or global nomading, or copies of some kind of eat, pray, love odyssey. The world is outside in. Even when we're trying to step off a path, our imagination is already infused with ideas from the outside about how that should look. Bacchus. Now Bacchus, he was inside out. He liked the wild, he liked beer, he liked the desert. At night around the fire he would sing rock and roll songs, talking Guns N' Roses, AC/DC. He was an avid reader with a depth of understanding about the ecology of the desert. Bacchus. His life reflected his essence. He was authentic. It's an interesting question, right? How much does my daily external life reflect the inner essence of who I am? When you close that gap, you're naturally becoming more yourself, and almost always more unique. Fitting in is somehow the opposite of belonging. On one of the days, Chris led the group to a murky swamp of hard, mineralized water in a rocky crevice of the desert. "This is a great place to swim," he said, stripping down naked as he spoke to the group. "You guys are going to love it." It was hard to be enthused about a swimming hole by a man who had been attacked by 2 crocodiles. He then charged off into the murky pool. His vigor made us follow him. I had heard Chris's crocodile attack story long before I met him. It was one of those famous stories in guiding circles. But he told us anyway, and I'll tell you what he told us. On a hot Sunday in the Kruger National Park, he had jumped into a waterhole that had a croc in it that Chris had watched for months. The croc would lie on the far bank day in and day out. On this particular day, when he dived in, the croc was lying on the far bank, and there was lots of beer involved. Chris jumped into the water, watching the croc he knew lived in the dam. He had seen it for months there. He was watching the croc on the far bank when he was grabbed by a second croc that he did not know was in the waterhole. He managed to fight it off and make it to the shore, where just as he exited the water, the first croc from across the water grabbed him and took his arm off. Chris managed to survive, and he was one of those wilderness guys whose momentary lapse of judgment had produced a lifetime of better judgment. We live in a society obsessed with highs, reaching optimization, presenting success. Characters have almost always made the kind of mistakes that wake you up. Characters have been down and found a way to come through their own failings of judgment. Characters have character because they are forged. Bacchus was a truly brilliant wilderness guide. He showed me how a guide's personality and essence could radically enhance the expedition. For a long time at Londolozi Game Reserve, where I live and work, we've had a strange recruitment policy. We've always hired characters, not credentials. You can train a person to run safaris, but you cannot train character. And almost always what makes for a vibrant and original space is that it has characters in it. Personal uniqueness makes for a kind of group originality. So where does this leave a story hunter? Well, for one, we must learn from our characters and become inside-out people. I call this actively emerging the gift, and it's a skill that comes from a quality of awareness. Almost always when I coach people, over time we start to discover a personal uniqueness that wants to emerge. In order for this to happen, one has to enter into a disciplined state of attention. You actually have to be paying attention to your inner world enough to know what's there. The first part is almost always subtractive, a shedding of sorts. The slow realization that so much of how you think you have to be is a series of learned and conditioned responses. For example, from the time I was young, I was told I was responsible for people's well-being. This was probably normalish for a kid growing up in a family of safari guides. But that responsibility exaggerated became a horrible, overbearing sense of responsibility for people and experiences that needed to be shed so a more spacious presence could take its place. If you're looking for your conditioning, look for stress, and then ask, what am I believing right now? There you'll find something worth looking at. I was always believing that everywhere I was responsible for everything going on, which is an incredibly controlling place to be. It needed to be shed. The next phase is paying attention to subtleties. What grabs your attention? The people, the places, what energizes you? The things you dream about, the people you feel naturally curious about. What naturally makes your energy feel expansive? The old adage of notice what you notice. In creative work, they call it finding your voice. In native cultures, they call it human making. In ceremonial spaces, people learn to be themselves. And in so doing, almost always, there is a way that something unique that they have to offer begins to present itself. A gift of singing, cooking, healing hands, organizing, supporting, leading. It emerges. The way to truly become someone who can fall in step with life's true characters is to become one. You cannot hunt the unicorn. You must become the unicorn. To become a compelling character, you must find your own essence and express it. Put together your own weird internal Venn diagram and then start to express it out into the world. Almost always when I have found myself in the presence of a true character, it has been because I have been following some strange internal pull that it has somehow connected me to my gift. Part of how I found Bacchus was because I said yes to going on a Namibian cycling tour through the desert because I heard that there might be a chance to track a desert black rhino. I was following my own love of tracking, and it pulled me into a situation where I could meet a Bacchus. There is good reason to find characters, and in so doing become one. Often reality conforms to what we imagine is possible from life and for ourselves. Characters almost always have a different worldview, and are often world-class in an unusual field. What seems impossible to you is simple to them in a different field. Making $1 million may seem impossible to your average, let's say, waiter or server, while being totally normal to your run-of-the-mill finance bro. Writing a book, growing a garden, learning to surf, making a movie. All of these are easy to someone. When you spend time with a character who has mastered a state, your own sense of what is truly possible is expanded. We create, weirdly, what we normalize as possible. It's the 100-monkey theory and the 4-minute mile. Characters help you imagine a world of possibility for yourself. So you need to cultivate your own inner world. Build your life from the inside out. Notice what you are naturally pulled towards, and you will find yourself cast as a character who lives amongst the unique characters of the world. Isn't that an interesting quest? To become a character who finds characters. If you do that, you will radically expand your sense of what's possible, all the different ways there are to live, and you will be a story hunter. Story Hunter, Episode 5, The Unseen Solitary Path. Are you willing to do what it takes to be creative? Art is experienced by the public, in the public, but in most cases, it is created in crushing solitude. I mean, you can become someone stories happen around. You could develop the right kind of eyes. Learn to be a contexting, meaning-making wizard. You can cultivate your story hunter and learn to put yourself in life's storied path. You can seek out life's characters, become a character who finds characters. And still, you would not have faced the quiet, desperate solitude of creativity. You see, at some point, if you are to produce good work, you will need to be alone in a room for a long time, totally by yourself. Walking between the computer, the paint, the guitar, and usually the fridge with some manic resistance. People will watch the film, and commentators will ask you interesting questions about the process of how you write, or make your movies, or make music. And you will answer in the moment as if the answers were consciously part of your creative genius, when in truth, mostly what you faced was the brutality of months in a dark editing studio, wrestling with the impending feeling that not only is the work shit, but that somehow you are shit. And of course, within that, there are days of beautiful flow. But mostly there will be a kind of self-consciousness, at times even a self-hatred of procrastination, some eating of bad food, as you languish in this dull, judging solitude. And I don't want it to be that way, and surely sometimes it isn't. There are days when it's not like that. But it is also always a profound challenge to be alone long enough to create something of quality. I certainly know this as a writer. It's downer stuff. The flow of creation is its own magical white-hot space, where one is absorbed and in tune with the muse. But the journey to that space is a dance in its lightest form, and a kind of battle in its shadow. David Foster Wallace spoke beautifully about the chasm between the making of art and the experiencing of it. It became hard for him to bridge the gap between the brilliance of his work and the way it was received, and the truth that hours and unseen hours were spent alone eating sweets and with a severe TV addiction, mostly while he failed to create, while the self-judgment of not writing became a deep band of self-loathing. As I write this, I am alone in an apartment on Cape Town, and today it's not going well. I have a burden of work to produce, including 2 books that I know I can write and am failing to write, and the rest of the Story Hunter series. What you will hear and assume about me when you eventually get to one of these end products will largely exclude this part of the story, which is that making art is fucking hard by any metric. I'm telling you this because this is where we cultivate creative resolve. I both need to be with how alone I am, trying to produce something worth something, unprompted, from my own being, because and only because I feel compelled to. How fucking insane is that? I think I have something to say. I know to say it, so I'm going to do what it takes to say it. Unfucking solicited. And so I have to ask myself, why? And I have to ask myself, how? Well, the why is its own form of commitment. And here I have to anchor myself to a future quality. It is my experience that my work has given me and others meaning. Martha Beck once told me that when she writes, she imagines she is in a room with one candle lit, talking to one person. And I often think of that person. I think of a campfire at some future event. People are laughing and drinking, and a story comes. The story is its own medicine. And it's medicine because the story is crafted. Specific words have code in them. If the story is good, it is my story, deeply personal. And strangely, if it is personal enough, it squeezes itself through a universal door into the collective secret garden of human experience. It becomes resonant because truth is truth is truth. Now at the fire the mood has changed, and something about how that story lived in me and came out on a day of solitary struggle is for everyone. I have to write. The stories I have written have a different texture to them than a story I tell off the cuff. And to write, I have to be alone enough to hear myself. So yes, I must suffer the aloneness that I am suffering now. Suffer it anchored somehow to that campfire in the future. How is simple. I must be alone. I must face terrible days of this battle. And then I must drink from the respite that creating within this hell gives me. In some ways, to actually sit down and create is a battle. So yes, the how is an act of courage. The courage to be alone enough, lonely enough, with my fridge-staring self enough, with my vices, to sit down and spray the page with my own process, and trust that in those days I am making my art's future. A story hunter must have the courage to be alone enough to make their art. A story hunter faces the resistance of now, knowing what it could give in the future. Story Hunter, Episode 6, The Personal Collective. If you have begun the journey of becoming a story hunter, you have become a character who finds characters, switched on your attention, learned to see with the right kind of eyes, become someone who can create context. You are now ready to touch the core of what makes a story elevated. I call it the personal collective. There is a strangely universal truth that the more in touch you are with your own unique personal essence, the more what you have to say becomes universally meaningful. The most private things are the most universal things. Any type of trying to be commercially successful or thinking about the end user while you work will kill an artist's freedom. Yet if you are a storyteller, you want the story to be listener-friendly. I always think about how a listener could put their own story into my stories. This is not a rule, but rather an orientation. Like a compass, I point personal story towards a subtextual universal story. A story always has an archetypal core. For example, I remember the story of a young woman named Jessica Shalor, who came to work as a safari guide at Londolozi when she was 23. The training was brutal, starting with a week-long military-style selection to find out who could handle pressure and to test a base level of capability. She scraped through. She made it into the next phase, which would be 6 months of intensity, learning the ecology of the wilderness, how to walk and be safe amidst dangerous animals, the intangible skills of guiding, and lots of presentation skills. Jessica hated public speaking. It was extremely difficult for her. Walking in the wild, she enjoyed, but speaking to groups of people terrified her. Jessica is a tall, brown-haired woman with dark skin and a disarming demeanor. She has the strength of a warrior and the softness of a heart. From her youngest days, she has communicated with animals in an almost mystical and psychic way. Her best friends have always been wild creatures, starting with a terrier named Shashi when she was a girl. When Jessica entered the training program, tragedy struck at Londolozi. A pride of lions that had lived on the reserve, called the Salala Pride, were attacked by other lions, leaving only one of the lionesses, a sole survivor. That lioness became known as the Salala female. She grieved the loss of her tribe members for about 8 weeks, returning constantly to where they had been killed and quietly contact calling for them. She was suddenly alone. Jessica could feel her grief every time she saw her. The lioness's coat grew tick-infested as she had lost her sisters and pride members to groom her. She was forced into solitary survival. She had to change the way she hunted, because now she was alone. She had to hunt by day to avoid other predators, stalking and charging out like a leopard. Everyone said that the Salala female would die now that she was alone. But when Jessica looked at her, she knew something different. She felt something in her bones. Suddenly, they were both in the wild, trying to survive in their own ways. They were two feminine beings who had to find strength in isolation. Salala female, the lioness, began to be Jessica's spirit guide and strength. Watching that lion adapt and survive each day, Jess saw an embodied power. It was not so much a rational thought, but a transmission of energy from the lioness's body to her own. In that lioness, she saw courage and strength and resolved, all modeled. One day Jessica was sitting in the camp when they heard the sound of a buffalo groaning in alarm. "Whoa!" The guides rushed out in Land Rovers and found the Salala female killing a fully grown male buffalo by herself. It was an awesome sight. Later that day, the Salala lioness walked past the open Land Rover. She was so close to where Jessica sat. She stopped and she looked up at Jess, staring for a long time into her eyes. Tawny eyes melted together in that moment. When Jess told me the story, she still gets shivers to this day. It was like a current of energy ran from that gaze into me, she said. It was all there in that look. Feminine power, courage, and strength. It was a single look that changed Jess's life forever. The lioness's strength became her strength. Shortly after that day, she passed her guide training with composure and confidence, as if the spirit of Salala was inside of her. The Salala lioness went on to mate and have cubs, seeing one of her cubs to adulthood before she was killed, protecting that cub from a male lion. Even in death, she was the archetype of feminine ferocity and power. I tell you this story because while it's true that most of you listening will never be training to be safari guides, and it's highly unlikely that you'll regularly be interacting with a wild lion, and yet you understand what it means to feel alone. You know what it's like to need to figure it out by yourself. Many of you understand abandonment, or that sense of being out of your depth. And some of you may even have experienced the drawing of strength from an animal, or from a person, who without saying a word touches you, someone whose very presence shows you and makes you strong. I, as the storyteller, don't need you to have ever been to the African bush to understand this story. In this story, no words pass between Jessica and the lion. What travels is primal energy, primal wisdom. And we all know what it's like to see a power that inspires you. There are universal energies we all recognize, and the lioness is such an image. And still, you can relate deeply to the personal universal within it. This is a story of resilience and feminine strength, a story of mentorship, a story of human-animal connection. I haven't really even built out the characters. In some ways, I've glossed over details, but there you are. Maybe you're already starting to think about who inspires you, what images of power and courage speak to you, thinking of who you draw strength from. The story takes you to your own encounters of those archetypal energies in your own life. The anecdote takes you to Africa, but way more importantly, the story takes you to your own life. What about something like this? I have suffered with severe depression in my life, severe at times, the type of depression that is accompanied by crippling anxiety. It started when I was 17, after a series of terribly traumatic incidences. Part of the experience of being depressed for me was that my mind moved from a get-to a have-to consciousness. Even things I liked were things I had to do. I realized, in fact, that everything I was doing, even sports or martial arts, were acts of refusal to give up entirely versus joyful pursuits. I remember feeling vacant. It was often worse in the morning when I would wake up with no joy for the day ahead. I wanted to be alone a lot, but being alone made it worse. At night, I would often find it hard to sleep, entering into a brainwave state that felt more like a numb trance. I was somewhere between the land of the waking and sleeping. I would tickle my own arm in this unconscious need for comfort. Sometimes I would wake up running my index finger over the soft skin on the inside of my elbow for hours as I lay in the dark. Psychologists call this self-soothing. Primates disconnected from their innate nurturing start to exhibit this type of behavior. It was my body unconsciously giving me what I needed. This story is less archetypal, and of course it's very, very personal. My bet is you related even more deeply to these strange idiosyncrasies that make us human. The detail of my finger on the soft skin inside my elbow brings us closer. Even if you have never done this, It's intimate enough that you relate to it through the human experience. Deeply personal is deeply universal. I tell you this, and I reiterate at this time, that being a story hunter is a practice. It's a way of being that is constellated through a disciplined attention. The story hunter is always aware of how with attention the personal can touch the universal. The story hunter must notice. The story hunter must know their own nature, and in so doing, they know the nature of life. One mind ties us all together. Story Hunter, Episode 7, A Story Apart. In any situation I find myself in, I always ask a simple and important question. What's the leverage point here? Leverage can be defined as to use something to maximum advantage. And I don't think of this as a capitalistic advantage. No, I'm more interested in leverage as optimizing the energetic gain for all. For me, a good story has always been leverage. When I was working as a safari guide, I would notice that whether the safari was going well or badly, a story could always shift the group's energetic momentum towards you, which is important when you're guiding. It was a tool that I came to rely on. A well-crafted story was not just a momentum shifter. It could, in the right light, at the right moment in the safari, infused with moonlight and wood smoke, be profoundly transcendent. When I started training young safari guides, we added a module to their training called Story Lab. They would tell a story, and then we would work on that story together, with the understanding that a good story can be made even greater with some creative workshopping. Sometimes a single word can change the impact of a sentence. Suddenly, the buffalo was very close, versus the buffalo was adjacent. It changes things subtly. We would play with the story, changing words, adding details, bringing core themes and threads, developing the characters and creating a universal personal. Sometimes the best stories happen in the moment or off the cuff, but mostly a story that has been worked on will develop layers of quality. Without fail, guides who develop stories set their experience apart. I'm telling you this because being a brilliant storyteller will set you apart in almost any setting. In entrepreneurship, you need storytelling. In leadership, you need storytelling. In fundraising, you need storytelling. As a guide, you need storytelling. At a party, you need storytelling. Morgan Housel writes, recognizing that the best story wins. Not the best answer, not the most accurate answer, not the answer people need to hear. The winner is just whoever gets the people to pay attention and nod their heads in agreement. If you're merely intelligent, you might focus all of your effort on finding precise truth. If you're smart, you'll focus just as much effort on delivering an effective message around the truth, realizing that the most powerful truth does no good if people can't pay attention to it. A doctor once told me there's a difference between an expert in medicine and an expert in healthcare. An expert in medicine knows all the right answers out of the textbook. They can diagnose with precision and are up to date on the latest trends. An expert in healthcare understands that medicine, from the patient's view, is intimidating, confusing, expensive, and time-consuming. Nothing you diagnose or prescribe matters until you've addressed the reality with patients, because even a perfect solution makes no difference to the patient who doesn't follow it. You have to be a storyteller. Taking the time to develop your capacity to tell stories will give you radical leverage through multiple fields. And if ever there was a man who leveraged his capacity for storytelling, it was the legendary South African storyteller David Rattray. Rattray had a superb voice, and had grown up in the hills of Zululand in South Africa. There he had learnt the stories of the Anglo-Zulu War. Rattray could take you onto a forgotten hillside on a hot day, and there he would stand with his signature stick, and with his voice as his art, he would tell you the stories of the battle that had raged. The experience was profoundly low-tech and sacred in its simplicity. As you sat there enthralled by David's storytelling, the empty land you stare at would come alive with the battle. David became world famous for his story of these obscure battles fought in obscure parts of Africa, simply because he told the story so well. People would come from all over the world to listen to this master standing alone on a hillside. What magnetism a story can have. David had found a single story that gripped in a way that would forever set him apart.
For various complicated reasons, an ultimatum was issued to the Zulus. The Zulus were perceived by the British colonial government in Natal to constitute a military threat to Lord Carnarvon's plan for the confederation of this country. The thrust of the ultimatum, which was issued on the 11th of December 1878, was that the Zulus would have to disband their army, and if they failed to comply with this within the prescribed period, it was the British intention to come and disband it for them. For various good reasons, the Zulus did not see fit to comply with the terms of this ultimatum, so Lord Chelmsford, in command of Her Majesty's forces in South Africa, decided that he would invade Zululand with 3 huge columns. The strongest of these 3 columns, the big central column, was to move from Pietermaritzburg to Greytown, across the Tugela River at the Tugela Ferry, and up onto the big plateau, the Biggersberg, which is a spur of the Drakensberg Mountains. And 12 miles southwest of Rorke's Drift, this column stopped and fortified a position called Helpmekaar. Lord Chelmsford and his staff decided to accompany the central column, so effectively he supersedes the column commander, Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn. Chelmsford is calling the shots. Lord Chelmsford stops the central column at Helpmekaar. When it became clear to Chelmsford that everything was proceeding according to plan, Lord Chelmsford descended down the Northstripper Pass to Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo River. It was New Year's Day, 1879, and there he waited for the ultimatum to expire, and that huge chaos of men, wagons and livestock that we described for you at Isandlwana, one must imagine at the mission station of Rorke's Drift. 4,800 men, 220 wagons, 4,500 oxen, and our friend Lieutenant Charles Harford of the 99th Regiment, who I have always used as a thread in my stories, mutters, "Rorke's Drift. What a pit," he said. It was impossible to take in a mouthful of food without imbibing at least a half a dozen flies. And one can imagine Welshmen writing home to their mothers in Monmouth that only a bloody Irishman could leave his name to a place like this, Rorke's Drift. Rorke's Drift had had quite a history even up until this point. If one looks from the mission at the Oscarberg Mountain, one can only see the rump of the hill. It is in fact a large mountain that rises up beyond the rump and drops off into the Buffalo River. The Zulus call the mountain Shiane, which means eyebrow. The mountain looks like an eyebrow. It was later renamed Oscarberg in honor of King Oscar of Sweden by the missionary Otto Witt. The mountain is terraced by a series of sandstone shelves puckered with caves. These caves are filled with Stone Age artifacts and rock art, indicating that this site was well occupied during the Middle Stone Age period. Archaeologists intimate that this site may have been continuously occupied by human beings for tens of thousands of years, and this human occupation may have something to do with a geological feature on the Buffalo River, 1,000 yards away. The Buffalo River, up until this point, is a big, slow, meandering stream. But here at Rorke's Drift it starts to cut its way into the low country, and its first move in doing so is to slide over a series of sandstone shelves which constitute the most magnificent series of natural causeways. A drift is a natural fording point on a river. There is a particularly good drift here at Rorke's Drift, a feature not repeated along the course of this river for more than 60 miles, and it was this ford that attracted those Stone Age people, and it was this ford that attracted Lord Chelmsford and his men. Rorke's Drift was named Rorke's Drift after an Irish trader come farmer called James Rorke, Esquire. Rorke was an energetic, intrepid, entrepreneurial Irishman. Rorke had come to this country in 1849. He came to South Africa because of a lack of potatoes in Ireland. Rorke had a huge farm, which consisted of the Shiane mountain and the Great Plain that extends north and west from the base of the mountain. Rorke built his little establishment up on a shelf of sandstone at the foot of the Shiane mountain. The shelf used to drop off about 4 foot sheer. The missionaries have broken and filled the steep bank over the intervening years. He built a house where the museum stands today, and 40 yards off to the north he built a storeroom where the little church stands today. The church is, in itself, an historic building. It was completed in 1882 and almost dates from this period. The church was built using some of the stone from Rorke's original storeroom and sits on the same spot as that original building. It is roughly the same size as Rorke's storeroom, and all one must do is imagine the church standing today, having a thatched roof and a veranda down its long side. In this storeroom, Rorke housed the commodities that he used to trade with his friends, the Zulus, and they loved him, and they called him Jimu, and they called his establishment Kwajimu, or Jim's Place. The old Zulu folk still call Rorke's Drift Kwajimu to this day. Rorke used to keep his milk cows in the well-built stone cattle kraal, which is still in its original position at the northern end of the ledge. James Rorke's great friend was the chieftain Schayo Gaqongongobese, was the wealthy and powerful chieftain who lived in the Bache River Valley opposite Rorke's Drift. Rorke and Schayo spent much time together. There are stories of these men walking the plains north of Rorke's Drift, clad in their jackets and cloth caps and shooting wildfowl together. These were balmy, happy days, and it is a great shame that it had to change. Schayo was the chieftain who in due course was to give Bartle Frere one of the pretexts for the issuing of the British ultimatum. Rorke was married to the most beautiful woman, Sarah. The local hunters of the period tell us that such a beauty was she, that after a protracted hunting trip to Mozambique and back, it was absolutely obligatory to pop in at Rorke's Drift just to gaze into the eyes of Sarah. This had the effect, they said, of raising one's flagging spirit. There is a photograph of Sarah in the museum at Rorke's Drift. I have stared at that photograph long and hard, and beauty I cannot find, and I've come to the inescapable conclusion that Sarah's reputation as a great beauty must have something to do with the scarcity value she must have enjoyed in these parts at this time. Rorke used to spend a fair amount of time sitting on his veranda, looking at his view, which was not a bad one, and apparently he sat there taking in vast quantities of square-face gin, to which eventually he becomes addicted. In 1875, James Rorke sent his women servants off to Ladysmith to replenish the supply of square-face, and they failed to return with this precious commodity, and in a fit of alcoholic rage, James Rorke shot himself. He now lies buried about 300 yards from the mission building at the foot of the Oscarberg mountain. He is buried under a yard of concrete. He did not want anyone to interfere with his remains. Exit, James Rorke. On Rorke's death, this property passes into the hands of the Swedish Missionary Society, and they sent out a rather controversial character to start up a mission station which, because of its juxtaposition with that excellent ford, was to service both banks of the Buffalo. His name was Witt, Otto Witt. It is not clear if Witt demolished Rorke's old house before rebuilding, or if he simply added on to the existing dwelling. But he built a substantial dwelling on the same spot, and it was this house of Witt's which was, as it happened, destroyed by fire during the course of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. But Witt returned in 1879 and rebuilt his house pretty much on the same foundations and according to the same design, and the building which is today the museum is the house that Witt built, and it's in its 1879-1880 condition. It has been beautifully restored and is today the most delightful little museum and well worth a visit. The differences between the building that you see today and the building as it was on the day of the battle are these. The building today has a corrugated iron roof, whereas the original building had a thatched roof, and this building, down two sides, consisted of a series of little cubbyhole rooms which communicated largely with the exterior. This is a peculiar piece of South African colonial architecture. It was because the loo was detached or semi-detached, and this was to have great moment in the battle. The existing veranda is probably original, It led on to 2 big ante-rooms, one of which communicated with a little cubbyhole room. And Witt lived in this house with his wife and 3 infant children. He did not have the gorgeous daughter that the movie Zulu gave him. Otto Witt was not particularly pleased to see Lord Chelmsford and his men. And Chelmsford, having descended from the healthy heights of Helpmachar down to these lower altitudes, notes immediately that his men started to succumb to those maladies that took more lives of British soldiers in this country than ever did the spears of the Zulus or the bullets of the Boers: dysentery and enteric fever. If ever you want the harsh reality of what fever did to British soldiery in this country driven home to you, you should wander through the cemetery at Intombe in Ladysmith, the cemetery that serviced the British garrison during the siege. Go and wander through those hundreds of crosses marking the graves of men who died of fever.
In some ways, so much of life is micro-stories. Imagine how many times in your life you will be asked the proverbial question, "Sir, what do you do?" Many people who I coach who are in transitions out of traditional careers into life and work that feels more aligned hate this question during the transition phase. They suddenly feel themselves in narrative no man's land, without a defined what I do box to tick. In fact, I know quite a few people who hate this question for multiple reasons. So often we find ourselves fumbling with our own shame or fear of grandiosity as we answer in staccato, vague terms. And it's not just those who are developing a path. I've heard multi-millionaires underplay themselves, saying things like, "I work in a bank," when they own a bank. Imagine if instead of hating the question, "What do you do?" we worked on our response, understanding that we'll be asked it all through our lives, and each time we answer could be a moment to set ourselves apart with an answer that profiled our work while creating intrigue and connection to the person asking us. That's a very short story worth working on. That's leverage. I don't think of leverage as getting ahead. I think of it as an opportunity to deepen connection. So, Boyd, what do you do? I'm a writer and a coach. I do some tracking in Africa, blah, blah. It's too many things. And this answer will need more explanation. Versus, I create transformational encounters for people in nature, and I'm on a mission to reconnect as many people as possible to the truest, most essential parts of themselves. I do this through multiple avenues of storytelling, coaching, and retreat spaces. Thank you for asking. What makes you feel most alive? In some ways, this is a silly example, but imagine the impact of working on the narrative of your mission, your work, how you think about what's important to you. When you work on a story, you are forced into a reflection. In some ways, you deepen what that experience means and has meant to you. You find layers inside of it, layers of understanding. There is this idea in writing that you should work in the book, and then at other times you should work on the book. Working in the book, you are actually writing. Working on the book, you step back to examine it. Arcs, character development, how themes emerge and tie together. Your work on the book gives you more context, so that when you go back to writing and working in the book, you're in a different headspace. In some ways, any kind of life coaching relationship is stepping back to work on your life so you can live in your life with more awareness. And this is what I'm proposing here as a story hunter. So much of the best of my life has come out of stepping back to work on the multiple stories that make up my life and developing these stories. I believe that this is work that you should take time to do, and I believe that it will radically leverage your life and impact in almost any setting. If you are cultivating your capacity as a storyteller, you cultivate your life. If you are becoming a storyteller, you are working on your life as much as you are working in it. Humans are narrative creatures. This has been true since the first people told stories around the fire. Become a master of narrative, and you are a world maker. You set yourself a story apart from everyone else. This story that follows is by a friend of mine, Andrea Sitole. Andrea has had an interesting life, to say the least. He's a superb tracker, safari guide and storyteller. He lives in the village of Justicia, west of the Londolozi Game Reserve. How he found his way to becoming a safari guide is a story worth hearing. I will leave you with Andrea's story that we worked on together in a story lab. This is Andrea in his second language telling his story, Into the Unknown.
Hi, my name is Andrea Sitole, and I'm a guide here at Londolozi. I grew up around my grandfather, who always tells stories. And in my culture, we'll have a boma, which is just for a man, and a boma, which is just for a woman. And that's how we will learn how to live as a man and how to live as a woman. Unfortunately, we are losing that campfire telling stories. And I was very fortunate enough to come and work here at Londolozi, which we still practice the campfire telling stories. And my grandfather, he always said that we all have stories. It's just a question of, do you share the story? So I just want to share my life story with you all, because I feel like by sharing a story, we can all learn something. My life is good, but my life hasn't been always that way. I was born and raised in Mozambique, in a beautiful town called Magudu. In 1978, a war has broke out in my country. We heard for weeks and months of the fight raging between government-backed Frelimo and a rebel-based Renamo. Reports will come in of intense brutalities committed against simple, kind-hearted village families who were living off the land in those areas. Stories of brutal rape, stories of death, stories of young children being taken away from their families and forced to fight and kill. Those were stories that filtered on my early childhood. And every day, the war came closer to us. And every day, the stories grew more common. And soon, we could hear gunfire from the distance at night. My family, over 30 of us, and me at the age of 3.5 years old, had to make a huge decision. Did we stay and take our chances with the violence? Or did we set off into the unknown in the hopes of finding a new life and a safe place? Behind us lay the war. Ahead of us, over 150 kilometers through wild, uncharted territories, full of wild animals, lay the hopes of making it into South Africa. In order to cross that wilderness, we knew we needed help. So we found our transporter. Transporters were professionals at getting you across the border into South Africa. They were hard men. They were men who understood how to operate in the bush. And they had a not so simple task to take you over 150 kilometers across dangerous wild terrain on an east-west trajectory through the breadth of Kruger National Park and deposit you in South Africa. So one early morning, with the sound of gunfire in a horizon around Magudu, we made a decision to go into the unknown and trust ourselves that we'll find our way and to track a new life. Our transporter's name was Mkwambana. I still know Mkwambana. And to this day, if you look on his eyes, you can see he's a man who's seen wilder parts of life. Mkwambana led over 30 of us into the wilderness. I remember that first moonlit night into the sound-filled darkness of Kruger National Park. We walked at night because we weren't welcome in South Africa. Bear in mind, In 1985, it was the apartheid South Africa. So it wasn't an exact warm welcome for a black family from Mozambique. So we're like in between a rock and a hard place. What will you do? We walked in a group, and one of the greatest problems that we faced was how we're going to find water along the way. We needed hydration because even though we walked in winter, it was hot. Mkombana knew some of the water holes, but often they were dry when we arrived there. And when we did eventually find a small water hole, it wasn't a crystal flowing water pool. It was a brackish pan with elephant dung floating on it. To us, though, it was like a pristine pool with Fiji bottled water. So if you are that thirsty, you realized that there is a wild animals inside all of us that was programmed to survive. At night, we will sleep in a groups that spread out. The idea being that we'll be able to keep a broad 360 degrees awareness. At that time, there were many refugees that were crossing the reserve, and lions had learned that people were easy feeding. There were many stories of men eating lions in Kruger that had particularly learned to feed on refugees that were crossing the reserve. In fact, one scientist noticed that the territory of lions in Kruger started to reflect the corridors where refugees regularly crossed. So we knew this. So can you imagine how we walked that gauntlet through the moonlit darkness, how our heart pounded? One of the other reasons why we would sleep spread out is that when lion did attack us while we were sleeping, they will probably get one portion, and the rest will be awake and quietly walk away. There were many stories of old men and old women that were making that journey, that could not keep up with the group, and they fell at the back of the group, and they fell further back, and they become prey to the predators. My earliest memories as a 3.5 years old was lying next to my mother, hearing lions roaring, elephant breaking branches, and hippos calling in the darkness. And even at that age, I remember the rapid drum of her heart as I held myself close to a warm body. And I realized that there's something really big that was happening within our lives. It took us 2 days of the most nerve-wracking fear, the most grueling walking, and eventually we crossed Mala Mala airstrip, walked through Londolozi Reserve, and late on the second day, we made our way into the western boundary of Sabi Sand, and we jumped the fence and arrived in the village of Justicia. It's not like our problem were over arriving in the village of Justicia. There were other Mozambican families back there, but we had to settle and immediately had to integrate our life into a foreign land. But there was some solace in a sense that we're now safe from the violence of the war. My late father, Domingo Sitole, was able to get a job here at Londolozi, working as a habitat manager. He tried to spend some time with me, but after my earlier crossing from Kruger National Park, my only interest was when he bring an impala ration back home for us to eat. Because remember, I'm second of 18 children. So to get enough meat was never easy. And when my dad will bring an impala ration back home for us to eat, we will feed like a pack of hungry wild dogs. So my first interest on wildlife was solely with eating it. Years passed, and I would come help my father from time to time. And soon, I was employed here at Londolozi as a tractor driver. I remember the day it all changed for me. The day I once found myself pulled off to follow the trek. I've been working on fixing roads somewhere because part of my job was to keep the reserve upgraded. Driving my tractor back home, I saw a leopard crossing the road, dragging an impala. I drove my tractor quickly to the area where she had crossed, and I felt this intense curiosity rise on me. Where had that leopard gone? I got out and I began to try and look. I can see where she had crossed the road dragging an impala. But as soon as the tracks left that soft and bare soil, I couldn't see where she had moved, even though she was dragging a 60 kg impala underneath her. Yet I knew there are men who will be able to see where her tracks led. I knew there are great trekkers in this area. Men like our transporter Mkombana, who has taken us across the border into South Africa. I wanted to be someone who could follow a faint track of a wild animals and find it into the wilderness. But I had no sense of how I will do it. And then thought, when we came to South Africa, we had no understanding of what will happen. And that's what gave me the strength to set off into my second journey to the unknown, which was the journey of becoming a trekker. I first asked a local guy here in the village of Londlozi, and he told me that to become a trekker, you need to look after your father's cattle. But believe me, my father didn't even have a goat. So how am I going to become a trekker? And then heard of two Londolozi legends, Alex van den Heever and Renia Simhlongo, who had started a trekker academy that took young men like myself in and for a year and put them into a grueling trekker training program that will give them the skills they needed. Half of that year meant leaving my family and going away in the middle of the country in a place called Samara. We trained 6 hours a day and were taught everything from tracks identification of small mammals, insects, frogs, birds, as well as the art of learning how to follow a wild animals, how to tap into the language of wilderness. 10 hours a day, in and for a year, all we did was immerse ourselves into the art of trekking. At that time, I was married. My wife and I were close. Leaving my family was hard, but I knew I had to go forward into unknown circumstances and trust my own curiosity and trust that I will find my way. During that year, I fell in love with trekking, and the dream that developed was of becoming a Londolozi trekker. But my place here was never guaranteed. At the time, all I could do is to look for the next tracks in front of me. You see, trekking is in itself a gift of being able to find your way into the unknown. It makes you present, and it asks you to open your awareness and open yourself to the way that the story wants to unfold. As I trek, I always think not just of an animal that I am following, but when we are willing to go after an animal with no sense of where it is, with no knowledge of where it might be, we are again committing ourselves to go into the unknown. And in the sheer act of being present into going to that unknown, it is incredible what encounter we're going to have along the way and what amazing things we can find. Since then, I have become addicted to this process. Maybe it's because it's in my blood from when I was young. But trekking became like a drug to me. It is my passion. It led me to realize my dream of becoming a trekker and then a ranger here at Londlozi. And it has taken me into other adventures. One of these adventures was when I was asked to go to Brazil to be part of a cutting-edge conservation project for 3 months. I've been working in a cattle range farm that has been converted into a jaguar reserve. There were jaguars there, but you couldn't see them like you see leopard and lions here at Londlozi. And the owners of the reserve in Pantanal wanted to rebuild the trust like we have here at Londlozi. And we told them that to do that you need to habituate the jaguars, track them, find them, and show them that you mean no harm. Bear in mind, I've never been on an aeroplane before, and the only time I crossed the country's border was as a refugee. So to fly to Brazil, to be part of a cutting-edge conservation project, was a real sign how our lives can change when we connect with our passion. Each morning I will go out and I will find the tracks of a jaguar and I will follow in a wilderness that is completely foreign to me. It was an incredible experience, and I can tell you now that 3 months that I've worked on that jaguar habituation project, they're now viewing jaguar on a regular basis. And people from all over the world has been inspired by seeing that animal to become custodian to the natural world. And sitting here tonight, I'm proud to know that I have some small part on it. Again and again, I can see the power that flows within us. But we have to be willing to go into the unknown and be present to where the treks wants to take us. If I can go from a war-torn refugee into a global ambassador for conservation and wilderness, then there are options for each and every one of us here. But we have to be willing to go into the unknown. And I promise it will lead you somewhere magical.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Track Your Life podcast with Boyd. To begin your own story hunting journey, sign up to the online course on Boyd's website, or just find him on Instagram, X, or your favorite podcast player. Please rate and review this podcast so that more people can find and enjoy it.